Welcome, age of vintage society. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, better known as Bonnie and Clyde, were the most well-known gangsters of the early 1930s, overshadowing John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly and Babyface Nelson during the Public Enemy era of American history. The Great Depression era outlaws and lovers became famous for their long string of robberies and murders across the western US. But there's more to their story. Why Bonnie and Clyde never actually stole millions of dollars. Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, the outlawed duo. Bonnie and Clyde robbery team that became notorious in the United States through their flamboyant encounters with police and the sensationalism of their exploits by the country's newspapers. Radio and newspapers of the day meticulously covered the couple's trail of bank and store robberies, auto thefts, abductions and kidnappings, and more than a dozen killings, of which 7 were law enforcement officers, in numerous US states. Possibly the most famous and most romanticised criminals in American history, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were 2 young Texans whose early 1930s crime spree forever imprinted them upon the national consciousness. Their names have become synonymous with an image of Depression-era chic, a world where women chomped cigars and brandished automatic rifles, men robbed banks and drove away in squealing automobiles, and life was lived fast because it would be so short. Of course, myth is rarely close to reality. The myth promotes the idea of a romantic couple in stylish clothes who broke the bonds of convention and became a threat to the status quo, who didn't fear the police and lived a life of glamorous luxury outrunning them. The reality was somewhat different. Sometimes incompetent, often careless, Bonnie and Clyde and the Barrow gang lived a hard, uneasy life, punctuated by narrow escapes, bungled robberies, injury and murder. They became one of the first outlaw media stars after some photos of them fooling around with guns were found by police, and the myth-making machine began to work its transformative magic. Soon fame would turn sour and their lives end in a bloody police ambush, but their dramatic and untimely end would only add lustre to their legend. Excessive and frequently sensationalised media accounts of the couple's antics split opinion among the Great Depression-stricken American public, with some seeing Bonnie and Clyde as romantic Robin Hoods of the day, and the others seeing the couple as bloodthirsty criminals. While the longevity of the story of Bonnie and Clyde may be more of a testament to the power of myth and media than to the couple's actual attributes, there is no question that their story continues to fascinate writers, musicians, visual artists and filmmakers. Clyde's middle name was Chestnut. The infamous criminal was also known as Clyde Champion Barrow. As a boy born into the family of a poor farmer, Clyde Bud Barrow's great love was music. Bud loved to sing and play an old guitar on the farm. He taught himself how to play the saxophone, and it seemed as if he might pursue a career in music. One of Clyde's older brothers was the main influence on his life of crime. Buck convinced the younger Clyde into petty thefts. Influenced negatively by his older brother, as well as a shady friend of the family, however, it wasn't long before Bud's interests turned from playing songs to stealing cars. As a teenager, Clyde attempted to enlist in the US Navy, but lingering effects from a serious boyhood illness, possibly malaria or yellow fever, resulted in his medical rejection. It was a hard blow for Clyde, who had already tattooed USN on his left arm. Little Bonnie Parker also loved music growing up in West Texas, and she also loved the stage. She performed in school pageants and talent shows, singing Broadway hits or country favourites. Bright and pretty, she told friends that they would see her name in lights one day. She was a big movie fan and imagined a future for herself on the silver screen. 6 days before turning 16, Bonnie married high school classmate Roy Thornton. The marriage disintegrated within months, and Bonnie never again saw her husband after he was imprisoned for robbery in 1929. She never divorced Thornton. She had a tattoo on the inside of her right thigh with two interconnected hearts, labelled Bonnie and Roy. Fame would come to both Clyde and Bonnie, but not as they had envisioned. Bonnie would eventually appear on the screen that she dreamed of, but only as part of a newsreel report detailing the exploits of her and Clyde's criminal misadventures. Their fame spread through, often inaccurate, reports of their criminal activities in local newspapers and true crime magazines. Although they at times revelled in the attention, most of the time it made their lives more difficult, since they could be more easily recognised by larger numbers of people. Clyde and Bonnie never quite surrendered their dreams. Bonnie's movie magazines were usually found left behind in the stolen cars that police recovered, and Clyde carried his guitar until he had to leave it behind during a police shootout. He later asked his mother if she would contact the police to see if they would return it. They said no. Clyde loved music right up until the end. Found in Bonnie and Clyde's ambushed death car was his saxophone. Barrow had been a criminal long before he met Parker. They met in Texas in January 1930. At the time, Bonnie was 19 and Clyde was 21. Soon after, he was arrested for a burglary and sent to jail. No jail cell could keep Bonnie and Clyde apart, and they were in love already. He escaped using a gun Bonnie had smuggled to him, was recaptured and was sent back to prison. Clyde was paroled in February 1932, rejoined Bonnie and resumed a life of crime. Bonnie even got in on the action, but was caught after a failed robbery and put in jail for 2 months. It was there that she started writing poems, mostly about her life with Clyde. After her short stint in jail, Bonnie was released from custody when she claimed that Clyde and his gang had kidnapped her. However, she went right back to him and their crime spree ways, even crossing multiple state lines to do so. The two began a crime spree that lasted 21 months. But Clyde actually did try to clean his life up, futile though it was. He started working at a glass company in Dallas after he was released, but lost his job because the police kept harassing him. Often working with Confederates, including Barrow's brother Buck and Buck's wife Blanche, as well as Ray Hamilton and W.D. Jones, Bonnie and Clyde robbed gas stations, restaurants and small-town banks. Their take never exceeded $1,500, chiefly in Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico and Missouri. On their first joyride, they decided to rob the hardware store that sat directly across from the Kaufman Town Courthouse. Bonnie was giddy with excitement until she heard the alarm. Not wanting Bonnie to be punished for her involvement, Clyde dumped her from the car and told her to catch a bus back to Dallas. Still in need of cash, Clyde and an accomplice decided to rob the local grocery store. The two men held the store owner and his wife at gunpoint and demanded their safe be opened. Sometime during the unlocking of the safe, a gun was fired and the grocery store owner fell dead to the ground. The men grabbed the money and fled. Unlike the previous robbery, this one involved murder. Weary from the stress of the road, Clyde began to feel the weight of his crimes. He would often shoot people in his way, but leave behind witnesses who could easily identify him. The police considered him a smart criminal because he would do his jobs near the borders of most states, so that he could cross into the next state without being followed by the police. The gang rarely stayed in one town for too long. While robbing a bank in Missouri, a guard discovered Clyde's intentions and began firing at him. In addition to the automobile theft charge, Bonnie and Clyde were suspects in other crimes. At the time they were killed in 1934, they were believed to have committed 13 murders and several robberies and burglaries. Barrow, for example, was suspected of murdering 2 police officers at Joplin, Missouri, and kidnapping a man and a woman in rural Louisiana. He released them near Waldo, Texas. Movies and TV have tended to portray Bonnie and Clyde as habitual bank robbers who terrorized financial institutions throughout the Midwest and South. This is far from the case. In the 4 active years of the Barrow gang, they robbed less than 15 banks, some of them more than once. Despite the effort, they usually got away with very little, in one case as little as $80. To law enforcement agents, the Barrow gang were cold-blooded criminals who didn't hesitate to kill anyone who got in their way, especially police or sheriff's deputies. Among the public, however, Parker and Barrow's reputation as dangerous outlaws was mixed with a romantic view. Despite the romantic notion that the two were young, free and in love, Bonnie had a serious leg injury that likely prevented her from being as free and easy we like to imagine her. Bonnie's leg had been seriously burned during a car crash with Clyde, a fact which some say explains why he's carrying her in some of the photographs. Their fame was increased by the fact that Bonnie was a woman, an unlikely criminal, and by the fact that the couple posed for playful photographs together, which were later found by police and released to the media. Though any loss of life is too many, the pair didn't actually harm that many people between them. Clyde kidnapped people when he could, preferring not to kill. When it came to release his captives, he would sometimes give them money so they could get back home. Unlike many of their contemporaries in the criminal world, Clyde and Bonnie were not lone wolves depending only on each other and a small group of like-minded criminals. They both had devoted families who stuck by them through their worst times, and they constantly made every effort to stay in touch with and support their relatives. If Bonnie and Clyde were doing well for themselves, their families would benefit too. In fact, Clyde was hoping to buy land in Louisiana for his parents when he was killed. Public opinion turned against Bonnie and Clyde after reports of the murder of two motorcycle cops on Easter Sunday 1934. Sleeping late in their car near Grapevine, Texas, Bonnie, Clyde and Henry Medvin were taken by surprise by the policeman, who suspected a car of drunks. Clyde's injunction to Henry to kidnap the cops, "Let's take them," was misinterpreted as an encouragement to fire, and Henry blew away patrolman E.B. Wheeler. The situation beyond saving, Clyde fired on the other cop, a rookie named H.D. Murphy, whose first day it was on the job. Murphy was about to get married, and his fiancée wore her wedding gown to the funeral. The public, who had often cheered the brash and brazen outlaws, now wanted to see them caught, alive or dead. The legendary quality of Barrow's and Parker's career is not difficult to understand, given the extreme desperation of the times. Their crime spree occurred at the height of the Great Depression, which hit particularly hard in states such as Oklahoma. Several bank robbers during this period became famous as Robin Hood figures, who struck back against the banks, which many people viewed as oppressive. The duo was depicted in the highly successful 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde, which spread the Bonnie and Clyde myth beyond the United States and helped to promote a kind of gangster chic, especially in fashion, in Europe and Japan. On May 23, 1934, notorious criminals Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow are shot to death by Texas and Louisiana state police while driving a stolen car near Sales, Louisiana. There are reportedly 150 bullet holes in Bonnie and Clyde's death car alone. In the autopsy, the coroner reported 17 bullets in Clyde and 26 in Bonnie, but that's only the official account. Unofficially, there were many more. The undertaker found it difficult to keep the embalming fluid in their bodies, such was the nature of their wounds. Ironically, the undertaker's assistant had been kidnapped earlier by the gang, and before they released him, Bonnie jokingly gave him $5 and asked him to take care of them when they died, not thinking he actually would. Although linked in life, Bonnie and Clyde were split in death. While the pair wished to be buried side by side, Bonnie's mother, who had disapproved of her relationship with Clyde, had her daughter buried in a separate Dallas cemetery. Bonnie's niece, who is her last living blood relative, said, "Their desire was to be buried side by side. I think that's the way that it should be. They made a spot next to Clyde for Bonnie back then. It's still there." Clyde was buried next to his brother Marvin underneath a gravestone with his hand-picked epitaph, "Gone but not forgotten." The pair attained such notoriety that hordes of people flocked to the scene of their death and later to the coroners to retrieve souvenirs. Some attempted to cut off Barrow's ear or finger, others took snippets of Parker's blood-soaked dress or shattered window glass. One man offered Barrow's father over $30,000 for Barrow's body, the equivalent of over $600,000 today. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. Now it is your turn. What do you think about the Bonnie and Clyde legend? How do you see them? As the romantic Robin Hoods of the day, or as bloodthirsty criminals?